Welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Friday, January 17th, 2025, and on Fridays we consider human behavior and justifications. Today we're going to be looking at the issue of corporal punishment. I'm sure that's something that everybody's familiar with to varying degrees. Perhaps you experienced it as a child growing up yourselves. Perhaps some of you may have even continued to use corporal punishment with your own children. It's certainly a controversial issue. A lot of different philosophical positions about child rearing and how best to do that. I'm not so much interested in those political or ethical debates about the legitimacy of corporal punishment. Rather, as a social scientist, I'm interested in trying to explain the conditions under which people are more or less likely to use corporal punishment. So, what are we talking about here? Well, for starters, every society engages in child rearing practices that involve various disciplinary practices. And some of these measures might be violent, some are nonviolent in nature. So, as a definitional matter, violence then refers to any threat, attempt, or use of unsanctioned, non consensual physical force by one or more individuals against another person or group. That definition in mind, corporal punishment thereby constitutes a specific type of violence. In other words, the use of physical force with the intention of causing a child to experience pain, but not injury, for the purposes of correction or control of the child's behavior. That's the definition of one of the historically leading experts in child rearing practices, and specifically an opponent of corporal punishment, the late Murray Strauss. Corporal punishment has been described as the most common form of interpersonal violence that children experience in their young lives. Uh, it currently or continues to affect upwards of 1 billion children annually across the world. And as a form of discipline, corporal punishment has evoked considerable controversy precisely because of the potential threats to healthy child development and perhaps even some adverse long term effects. So, why engage in such behavior then if there are alternative strategies available? The simple and unsatisfactory answer: because we're human. Even the most well educated among us, informed of the evidence, probably have occasionally at least used some type of corporal punishment, perhaps a mild form, despite the policy of not ever using physical punishment or discipline with your child. I also should mention, too, the importance of the distinction between moralistic and predatory forms of violence. So, moralistic violence refers to a form of social control in response to what parents believe to be problematic behavior on the part of their child. And that's quite different from predatory violence, wherein they're usually using the violence in the pursuit of their own personal pleasure or for sadistic purposes or simply to exercise power over the child. So the guiding assumption suggests that human beings are, of course, complex, adaptive actors who operate in a multidimensional reality that includes the physical, the organic, the mental, and sociocultural conditions. And so an effective theoretical strategy should integrate these complementary perspectives to offer a more complete explanation of the different facets of interpersonal violence in general and corporal violence in particular. So I'll briefly outline the logic of the integrated framework that I tend to use and look, especially with respect to trying to study human social behavior across these 5 different levels of behavioral complexity. And I'll then apply the integrated approach to the analysis of corporal punishment so that I can present a series of testable propositions that purport to explain why parents or caregivers might use corporal punishment rather than an alternative. So, in my view, human beings are these adaptive creatures who are subject to multiple forces rooted in different forms of energy and information exchange. across 5 levels of experiential reality, the first of which includes the behavioral investment framework. The behavioral investment framework refers to, or I should say, focuses on the biopsychological forces that drive energy investments and that are used to exchange information and that are absolutely essential to all animals, including Homo sapiens as living sentient organisms. The second level refers to the socialization framework, which focuses on the psychological or the social psychological components of the processes that are associated with human development, learning, personalities, and identity formation. The third level includes the cultural justification framework. This involves the full range of symbolic information and the different forms of human reasoning that people use to evaluate their environments, and in many instances are ultimately to justify their actions based on their linguistic and cultural backgrounds. A fourth level includes the the social location framework, which includes the social networks within which human beings are located, the relative statuses of those involved in various interpersonal exchanges, and always situated as well within social fields of interaction, all of which then is also then located within a societal context framework. The societal context framework then refers to the broader socio-historical and institutional context within which individuals and groups are situated. So I'm going to apply then this framework to briefly discuss and propose several ideas about why corporal punishment tends to persist, or what the drivers and the mechanisms are that are associated with each of the 5 different levels. So, at the first level, every living organism has capacities to process information and to arrive at different types of behavioral investments that will enhance their survival, at least from an evolutionary standpoint, as well as their long term reproductive advantages. That logic applies to human beings as well to a degree, which includes their disciplinary practices with their offspring. Most corporal punishment theories focus on parents and primary caregivers to identify those factors that induce their use of physical force against their children. So, at the level of the human animal, the use of such force has been observed as a relatively common practice across all primate groups. While human cognition and cultural practices obviously differentiate us from all other primate species, a notable similarity involves the inverted U-shaped relationship between age and discipline techniques. Excuse me. That is, the incidence of CP use among primates, including humans, increases from infancy to early childhood, peaks, and then starts to gradually decline as the primates enter their what we would call an adolescence and as they get older. From an evolutionary perspective, parents regulate their offspring's behavior through energy expenditures that are designed to facilitate or help ensure their offspring's survival and relative fitness, while maximizing their own reproductive potentials at the same time. So Trivers once argued then that not all children or siblings then enjoy precisely the same genetic advantages. And as such, they're not all equally valued from a parental standpoint. And so, in that sense, then, several propositions emerge. That is to say, that corporal punishment is predicted from an evolutionary standpoint and from a behavioral investment standpoint to vary directly with offspring vulnerability. In other words, the child's relative lack of fitness or genetic fitness. Moreover, don't want to jump ahead too quickly. Moreover, having more children and in closer succession both increase parental use of CP toward their offspring. Additionally, as biopsychological organisms, humans are directly influenced by a combination of more immediate neurocognitive and physiological processes. These factors are often not measured, or at least typically at the moment of the parent child interactions. And as a result, the precise mechanisms involved are difficult to verify. A third proposition would be that CP varies directly with increased levels of cortisol and global indicators of increased stress. The combination of high stress levels and parental depression also tend to deplete available resources and induce maladaptive coping mechanisms. Again, as a general principle. And finally, parental depression and substance abuse both directly influence, or at least are predicted to, and indeed the research has shown to a certain degree, influence the likelihood of parents using CP upon their offspring. So that's the behavioral investment framework. Of course, human beings are socialization creatures too. We socialize our children. And so, in addition to evolutionary processes and pressures, we can also look at the extraordinary levels of social engagement that commences for humans, of course, right from birth in the earliest developmental stages. So, social learning theorists argue that parents who use violence do so mainly because they've been subjected to physical punishment themselves or witnessed such violence in their families of origin. Humans can be socialized then into viewing violence as an adaptive response to conflict. As such, parental exposure to CP in childhood predictably leads to an increased use of such practices with their own children. Just as social scientists have hypothesized that the intergenerational transmission of violence contributes to the sustenance of intimate partner violence, the same cycle of violence logic applies with respect to child disciplinary practices and the use of CP. A second proposition would be that parents that are exposed to multiple adverse childhood events or experiences, these are sometimes referred to as ACEs. These folks themselves, or I should say their exposure to ACEs, directly affect as well the possibility and the probability of subjecting their own children to CP. The distal factors include several ACEs, such as surviving childhood physical or sexual abuse, or witnessing their mothers or parents being abused, poverty, household mental illness, exposure to being spanked, and so on. All of these independently and even more dramatically, cumulatively increase the odds of subjecting their own children to CP down the road. And so the impact of cumulative forms of trauma themselves exacerbates the use of harsh physical discipline. So those who've experienced PTSD are also more likely to believe in and to use CP with their own children. So that's at the level of socialization. In addition, human beings are the justifying animal. We have evolved not only to engage in behavioral practices that are aimed at enhancing our survival, but these include as well the key linkages between mind and culture. That is, the evolution of human self consciousness, which included the capacity for a reasoning system so that we could communicate with each other in specific ways. And this would provide a window, if you will, into each other's minds and motivations and emotions. And so the unique aspects of the human linguistic evolution involve our requirements then to provide an explanation for our behavior. The lion chasing down and killing the zebra in the Serengeti doesn't worry about explaining his behavior to the pride or why the killing was justified or that one of the cubs might object because she's now a vegan. Humans do. Humans have to worry about these issues. We've evolved such that we have to provide cultural justifications for our actions. We have to explain ourselves. And so another aspect of socialization involves acquiring the parental knowledge about optimal childbearing practices. At the same time, anybody who has less information about disciplinary practices, by definition, is going to be more constrained or have fewer options available. And so the presence of socialization in our lives and the exposure to different forms of violence helps to communicate to those who experience and or witness such violence that that's endorsed, that's supported, that's even valued perhaps in some instances. And so what we see then is, to a certain degree, the use of violence communicates to children or communicates to the offspring that such violence can indeed be justified or accepted as a standard cultural practices or even a dominant cultural value, which was certainly the case a couple of generations ago, or when my cohort, for example, the baby boomers, were being raised as children. The use of corporal punishment was not universal, but nearly so, and almost everyone engaged in such practices and could justify their use of corporal punishment based on the dominant cultural scripts of the day. Okay? And so, not surprisingly, we predict then that if there's a higher degree of internalization of attitudes favorable towards the use of physical violence as a disciplinary practice, then this is going to increase the odds of parents using CP as at least an option, or one of a range of perhaps different disciplinary practices with their children. In addition, in general, corporal punishment will vary directly with the presence of favorable cultural scripts with respect to using such disciplinary practices within families. And indeed, we also note that, or we predict, and indeed the research confirms as well, that the increase in the amount of information and parental education that parents receive tends to be associated with a declining or a lessening use of corporal punishment as a disciplinary practice. Higher educational attainment implies some degree of exposure to new ideas and perspectives, which might dampen the enthusiasm for exercising physical discipline towards one's children. Okay? And finally, I should mention too that corporal punishment varies with religious conservatism. The role of religion arguably has an impact on CP justificatory practices as well, such that conservative ideas about traditional family values and roles and child discipline practices uh, tend to coalesce, and they tend to be more favorably predisposed and justified or use references to their religious traditions as justifications for the continued use of corporal punishment. And then we come to the social location framework. All right. This is sort of my specialty in terms of the research that I do. And here we're talking about human beings and their social locations. So I focus a lot on their interactional dynamics and the different kinds of social networks within which human beings are located, including and most importantly, the relative statuses of those who are involved in interpersonal exchanges and the parameters of the social fields within which they engage one another. And so let's start with the obvious. Children have fewer resources relative to their parents, which reflects often the hierarchy or standard kind of hierarchical uh, organization of most families. And as with most punishment practices, the existence of a social hierarchy within families creates the conditions that are going to be more or less supportive of corporal punishment. And from that measure and logic, then CP varies directly with degree of family hierarchy. A greater concentration of power and authority in parental figures yields higher levels of physical discipline compared to more, shall we say, democratic or egalitarian households. And in general, the more vulnerable individuals are, the greater the risk that they have for being punished physically as well. Um, this again occurs or appears across a range of different societal contexts. And so, as a general principle, even cross culturally, the more severe punishments tend to be directed against those who are both less powerful or able to defend themselves, as well as those who are more vulnerable. Okay? So these are powerful social factors that affect the likelihood of corporal punishment emerging. A corollary proposition is that the greater power imbalance between parents and their children leads to an increased probability as well of using physical discipline. So those who are most inferior within the family, typically the youngest, for example, are more likely to experience corporal punishment, and the data confirm that. Just as not only do parents stand in different relationships with their children in terms of their age factors, but also with respect to control over different types of resources and shared living arrangements, which in and of themselves can provide more opportunities for interactions and potentials for engaging in norm violating behavior. And in that sense, the argument would suggest that corporal punishment varies directly with increased levels of intimate family exchanges. So that just the mere fact of regular interactions in a shared environment uh, will increase the pressures that people are under, especially if the parents, for example, are already experiencing other sorts of problems. And under those conditions, the likelihood of corporal punishment emerging as a shorthand strategy for physical discipline that tends to increase as well. Similarly, if parents are dealing with so called more difficult children, and not all children respond the same, some children are more difficult, shall we say, all else equal. And under those circumstances, again, if there's already a high degree of stress and pressure within the family situation, or if they're dealing with health problems or what have you, then these factors individually and cumulatively also increase the risk of corporal punishment. The stressors in general that are associated with more time spent together deserve more research. Although we have something of a natural experiment with the COVID-19 pandemic. The sheltering in place and the loss of jobs all created pressures and increased the amount of time spent together. And so the research has pointed, well, it's been somewhat mixed, but there's some research that suggests that the levels of family violence actually did increase, or domestic violence in general did increase with the lockdown. There's some counters to that research as well, I should mention, because the other aspect, or if you will, the countervailing force, might be the degree to which families rallied together and under sources of strain, in some instances, ended up building a higher degree of positive relationships and support. And so I think one of the things that needs further investigation would be to differentiate between those sort of different familial responses. So that's why I'm not ready to say definitively that just the lockdown in and of itself increased levels of domestic violence. I think it probably did, but we have to be more specific about the conditions under which that would have happened. And of course, recognize that not all families responded to the stressors or even were subjected to the same levels of the same degree of pressures across the board. So, more research, I think, needs to be done in this regard to come up with a more definitive answer. What seems to be indisputable, I would argue, from a more sociological and criminological and behavioral perspective, is that not all relationships within families in terms of social connectedness are equal either. So, corporal punishment tends to vary directly with the levels of social distance between parents and their children. That is to say, then what we find is that children who are living with step parents or who are adoptees, okay, or especially foster children, are more socially distant than those who live with their and grow up with their biological parents. That's a definitional matter. That latter group, right, those are with the bio moms and bio dads, that sort of thing, already has an established relationship, perhaps right from the outset. And that means too, typically, a more at least more of a shared background, language, ethnicity, and culture compared to those children who enter into the family relationships or the family dynamics later. Again, those who are adopted, those who are foster children, even the step parent dynamic, the step parent versus vis-a-vis the stepchild dynamic. So all of these are indicators of different levels and degrees of social distance between parents and their offspring. And finally, corporal punishment does appear to vary directly with the degree of social isolation to which families and parents and their children are subjected and their levels of privacy. You ever seen those situations where somebody's admonishing a child in public and they say, wait till we get home? Well, what they're emphasizing there is the social isolation, the what they can do behind the walls that we don't see. And so if a society is organized so that families are more private by definition, or they're organized in such a way as to live in separate houses where there's a greater degree of social isolation, we'd expect levels of corporal punishment to increase under those circumstances as well. The research in general has long confirmed the risks or the higher risks of multiple forms of family violence and abuse that are associated with social isolation, and not just, and beyond just the issue of physical discipline of children. Okay, and finally today, we can also refer to or make reference to the societal context framework. That can't be ignored either, since families are situated within communities and connected to societal institutions in countless different ways. Most notably, some communities clearly have higher rates of aggression or violence, which permeates the local ecology and the lived experiences of families and their parents who have to protect their children. These are, in some senses, the metaphorical prison walls that Berger and Luckman referred to in their Social Construction of Reality book. And so, in that sense, corporal punishment varies directly with higher rates of community violence in general. In considering broader neighborhood environments, those who live in communities with higher levels of crime and aggression in general also report experiencing higher levels of stress and a greater likelihood of using corporal punishment. Indeed, the evidence has long shown that CP usage displays regional variations, for example, in the United States, such that there are higher rates of usage within the US South and among rural families. In addition, CP varies directly with communal and cultural acceptance of physical discipline. One study found, for example, that in non Southern regions, parents' CP support has declined over time, especially amongst wealthier parents, while parents' support for CP has remained stably high and over time across socioeconomic distributions in the South. So these findings imply a distinct cultural perspective on corporal punishment that could pervade Southern life in general, which might also help to explain its continued higher usage within school systems, again, in the South compared to non Southern states. And regional variations apply not only within, but of course between societies as well, in terms of the dominant institutional frameworks and justificatory practices, and of course legal practices as well. And so we can even consider them the fact that some countries, an increasing number in fact, have banned corporal punishment practice altogether. Uh, I wouldn't expect corporal punishment to just simply disappear completely from those societies, but I would expect there to be far less corporal punishment in such societies, just as in parallel, the levels of smoking have declined dramatically in our own society, in Canada and the United States. There's a sort of generational aspect and a regional aspect to all of that behavior as well. Again, this proposition shows some early research and deserves further examination, in my view. Okay, so in conclusion, I'm not saying that we know exactly how and why, under every circumstance, a parent's going to engage in corporal punishment, but we have, with today's brief talk, mapped out this multi level explanatory approach to study human behavior in general, and it applies quite well, I hope you'll agree, in the study of corporal punishment. And so in this case, I'm arguing that we can look at five different levels of experiential reality, from behavioral investments to socialization to cultural justification practices at the individual level to people's social locations and their networks to the broader societal context within which they find themselves situated. And there are key mechanisms, I believe, associated with each of these five different levels that help us to explain the relative use or non use of corporal punishment across a variety of different contexts or different families. And all of these are testable, and we can evaluate the propositions more formally through research. A number of studies have already done this, as I've suggested, so I'm not just pulling ideas out of thin air, but I've tried to, in effect, summarize in as succinct a fashion as possible what much of the dominant research has shown in this regard. And so the overarching thesis in conclusion suggests that if we hope to understand and explain more fully why human beings use violence in general and in the context of family relationships, including corporal punishment practices, then we have to consider the different influences and the possible impacts of factors across these five levels of experiential and organizational reality. We have more work to do, to say the least. Okay, thanks for listening as always. May you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. And hopefully, we'll see you again tomorrow. Have a good one.